Hi guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you how I took this image of a ladybird from this to looking like this using editing software. Just before I get into the video, I want to quickly mention that I have a print shop on my website. If you're interested in having my images on your wall, then I'll leave a link down below in the description to my website. I'll begin my editing process in Lightroom. This is where you can import and organize all your files, and you can also color grade them. Lightroom is a monthly subscription, so if you don't want to pay for editing software, there are free alternatives. Just give it a Google and you'll find alternatives very similar to Lightroom. As you can see, I've got all my images imported into Lightroom here. And the very first thing I do when I start editing is find the image with the eyes in focus. So, oh, that's pretty lucky. I actually clicked on the exact one. So once I found it, I rate it 5 stars. So I know that's the one with the eyes in focus. And then as you can see, I've got loads of images here because I shot a focus bracket. So I focused from the front of the subject all the way to the back. Because as you can see, this single image, the depth of field only has a bit of the eyes in focus. So if I want any more of the subject in focus, I'll have to focus bracket, which I did out in the field when I took the image. And then I'll have to focus stack, which I'll get onto later. Just before I start editing this image, what I like to do is organize my files ready for focus stacking. So what I mean by that is I find the very first image I want to use in my stack. And for this shot, I think I want just the whole ladybird in focus. And I want this foreground to be out of focus because that will look very nice and create some depth. So this image looks perfect. It's just before the ladybird's in focus. So I'll rate that 5 stars and I'll press 8 on my keyboard as well, which will turn that green, indicating it's the first image. Then I'll come down a bit and try and find the very last image. I want to focus stack to the very edge of the ladybird. I don't want to focus on these legs in the very background. So I think I'll go a few images forward. About here looks good, so rate that 5 stars. And then we'll press 6 on our keyboard. And that will turn it red, indicating that that's the last image I'm going to use for my focus stack. Now I can return back to the image with the eyes in focus, which is this one here, and start editing the image. I like to start my edit by adjusting the white balance. And at the moment, looking at this image, it looks a little bit too warm. So I'm just going to drag the white balance to the left, which makes it colder. And around 5100 looks pretty good. And if I zoom in and look at the other colors in the image, I feel like it's a tad too bit green. So if I just drag the tint to the right, increase the purples, don't want to go too extreme, about 10 looks pretty good. So yeah, I'm happy with the white balance now, and I'll move on to the basic adjustments. When I'm making adjustments to my exposure, I like to look at the histogram as a reference. So if you look at my histogram now, it's actually quite nicely exposed. If I increase my exposure by about 2 stops, as you can see, it's clipping on the right there, or the graph moves to the right, and that means it's overexposed. So you want your graph to look something like this, where it's not touching the edge of the histogram. And at the moment, the exposure looks pretty perfect. However, I want to adjust a lot of other things such as contrast, highlights and shadows, as I want to prepare my image for the tone curve later on. So what I like to do is actually remove contrast. So I'm going to have about -30. And then I'm going to decrease the highlights just a little bit so I can adjust those later in the tone curve. Only about 27, that should be good. And increase the shadows a little bit to reveal more detail. About 25. The whites, I think I'll leave them as they are. They look decent at the moment. And then the blacks, increase those, or I should say decrease because I'm taking the blacks out of the image. Put that about 70 odd, 75. And as you can see, the image is really low contrast at the moment. And you might be thinking, why am I doing that? It's because when I go to the tone curve later on, I have a lot more control over the contrast in certain areas of the image, as opposed to adjusting your contrast in the contrast slider. Moving on to the tone curve, I like to go into the color channels first. So I'm going to go in the red channel, make a tiny little S curve, just like so. And then copy those channel settings and paste it in the green and blue. And as you can see, the colors have come back to normal now, and that's added quite a bit of contrast. In the regular tone curve, I'm going to place 3 points on my graph, 1 here for the shadows, 1 here for the mid-tones, and 1 here for the highlights. What I can do then is lift these up and down to decrease and increase the shadows. So I'm just going to decrease it a tiny bit, something around there. I'm gonna keep my midtones around the same, but my shadows a bit further down this way. And then highlights, I'll boost them a bit. Something around there looks pretty good. And then right here, we've got refined saturation. So as you can see, if I drag it to the left, it takes a bit of saturation out because the tone curve actually adds saturation. So I'm gonna decrease that to 0. That's what I usually do for most of my images. And as you can see now, if I toggle the tone curve on and off, so this is off, you can see there's a lot more contrast in the image and it looks very nice. And if I press Y on my keyboard, I can see the before and after of all the adjustments I've made so far onto my image. Next up, I'm going to play around with the calibration tab, and this is where you can drastically change the colors in your image. And the reason I'm doing this now is because when I mess with the colors in here, it's a lot easier to go back to the HSL tab to fine tune all the colors. And as you can see, the greens are a bit orangey, yellowy sort of hue. But if I move the hue of green primary to the right, there's a greater contrast between the greens and orangey yellow colors in the image. I don't want to go too extreme because as you can see, it goes a bit crazy. So I think around, we'll say 10. Don't want to go too extreme. I'll also adjust the blue primary by moving it to the right. And when I do this, it makes the greens a lot more green. But as you can see, it goes pretty extreme very quick. So I want to be very subtle with this. Around probably just +5, I think will do. And if I bring the saturation up, that actually brightens a lot of those green colors quite naturally. So I think just a little bit to boost those colors. Probably +15 will look quite good. Moving on to the HSL tab, this is where you can change the hue, saturation and luminance of all the colors in your image. And I don't think I'm going to change the hues of any of the colors. They look quite good as they are, but I am going to change the saturation. So I want to boost some of these oranges on the ladybird's shell. So I'm going to say around 15. Don't want to go too crazy. Yellows, I think I'll just keep yellows as they are. Greens, I might actually desaturate them because if I desaturate the greens, it brings more focus to the orange of the ladybird. But I still want them to be quite saturated, so I'm only going to do about -15, I think will do. That is all I'm going to do in the HSL tab, just to subtly create more contrast between the colors. The color grading tab is something I don't really use that much for macro photography, but I think for this image, I'll add a tiny bit of blue into the shadows. And I tend to always add the 215 hue, so it looks like that. And saturation wise, I'm going to add around 10. And that's looking a bit too strong. So you can come down here into the blending and balance. I tend to just adjust the balance, and something around 30 looks good. So that's just very subtly adding a bit of blue tint to the shadows. Moving on to the detail tab, the only things I adjust in here are the amount of sharpening applied to my image and the masking of the sharpening. So I start with the masking by holding Alt on my keyboard and then dragging the slider to the right. And these white bits are what the sharpening has been applied to. So this image has the eyes in focus, so I want most of the sharpening to be applied to that. Around 45 looks pretty good, so we'll leave it there. And then I'm going to change the amount of sharpening to 60. That works very well for the images shot on this camera and lens setup. And then the very last thing I do in Lightroom is remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And if you go into manual here, you can manually select and adjust any chromatic aberration that hasn't been removed from ticking that box. So you can use this eyedrop tool to select any chromatic aberration, but as you can see, this image is perfectly fine. I don't see any noticeable chromatic aberration. So we'll leave it at that and move on to the next step of editing. Once I've finished my edit and I'm all happy with it, what I do is paste the settings onto all the other images that I'm going to use in my focus stack. So all I have to do is come out here, right click on the image where I've got the edit applied to, click on develop settings, copy settings, check all, copy, and then click on the first image I want to use for my focus stack, and then hold shift and click on the last image I want to use for my focus stack. And then right click and develop settings, paste settings. And that just applies the edit to every single image that I've selected there. And once that's applied to every image, I right click, export, and then I've got a preset here called Zerene TIFFs, but I'll show you the settings I've got set up. I've got TIFF selected, compression, none. sRGB color space, that's why I edit all my images in. Bit depth, 16 bits, and 300 pixels per inch. I've left unticked sharpening because I'm going to do that in Photoshop later on. So yeah, that's all the settings, and then I just have to click export, and those will go to a folder on my desktop, and I will load those into Zerene Stacker in a moment. Now I've exported all my images, I've got Zerene Stacker open, and to get my files in here, all I've got to do is click File, Add Files, and then select all the images I want to focus stack. To create a stack, all you've got to do is come up to Stack, and then as you can see, you've got Pmax and Dmap. These are different algorithms. Pmax usually optimizes for sharpness, but the colors aren't as good, and it usually looks a little bit grainy. Whereas Dmap, usually the colors are quite nice, but you do have quite a few artifacts that you have to clean up. But what I like to do is actually run both of the algorithms. So I click Align and Stack all both. And this will take a couple minutes, so I'll cut forward to when the stacks are complete. So the Pmax will run all the way through in one go, and you won't have to do any extra steps. But the Dmap comes up with this menu halfway through saying set contrast threshold. And what this is you essentially tell Zerene Stacker what parts of your image are out of focus and what parts of your image are in focus. So what you want to do here is drag the slider to the right and have all the out of focus areas in black. And you want to push this as much as possible and have as much of the out of focus areas in black. Don't worry about little bits being on your subject, it's not too much of a big deal. So around 85 looks pretty good, and then we'll hit OK, and that will run the rest of the Dmap, and we'll just wait for the Dmap to finish stacking. We've now got two output files, one stacked with Pmax and one stacked with Dmap. As you can see, the Pmax is quite grainy and quite high contrast and quite sharp, whereas the Dmap is a bit softer, not as bright, a bit nicer colors and less grainy. So what I like to do is usually retouch with the Dmap as the base because that's my favorite image. And then I can paint in either a single image from my input files, or I can paint in some of the parts of the Pmax file. To start retouching, all you do is select an image that you want to retouch. So I like the Dmap, I'll select that one. And then you hit Edit, Start Retouching. And as you can see here, the final image that I'm going to be editing is on the right. And then all my input files and images I want to merge with that image are on the left. So essentially all the images that you are working with are on the left. And then your image that you're working towards, so your final image stack, is on the right. So as you can see, I've got my list of images if I want to paint a specific part of an image into my output image on the right. Or I can come down here and select Pmax, and I can paint in parts of the Pmax onto my Dmap. So if we zoom into the image, we can see some of the artifacts where the stack didn't go well. By this spider web, a bit here as well, a little bit down there. Spiderweb's gone a bit messy. On the actual ladybird itself, it's looking quite clean. There's a little bit of a mess underneath here. A few missing hairs and stuff there. But overall, the stack has worked very well, so there shouldn't be too much I have to retouch. But I'll show you all the retouching I do anyway. My favorite thing to do is select Pmax because this usually stacks things that overlap very well. So for example here, the Dmap didn't really stack this part well. If I hold Alt, I get a preview of the Pmax file. And as you can see, that has stacked a lot better. So all I'm going to do is let go of Alt to stop previewing it, and then paint over that bit to add the Pmax onto my Dmap file. And I'm just going to repeat that process, basically hold Alt to preview my input file, and then paint over any areas that look better. So yeah. So Pmax works very well for overlapping things and hairs, but in some cases it won't work well. So I'll move on to that in a second and show you what I mean. So I'll finish going over the image and painting in all the areas where I think the Pmax works well, but I'll now show you where the Pmax doesn't work well. So for example, this bit here, as you can see, there's some artifacts. If I paint my Pmax onto it, as you can see, it's very dark and grainy. And if I zoom out, it's very distracting. There's just a dark blob there. So I'm gonna revert that. And what I want to do is select an image where the edge of this is in focus. So the very last image is perfect. And then I'll zoom in and just paint over that like so. And if I zoom out now, as you can see, that is very clean and it looks like there's no artifact there at all. I'll do the same for this bit up here as well. As you can see, there's a little bit on the left. I'll get that first. And then on the right, there's a lot of artifact. So we'll clean all that up. And you've got to have very high attention to detail for doing stacks, because there's certain things you won't notice if you don't zoom in and look close enough. But at the same time, you could waste a lot of time and spend all day retouching every single little detail. So just make sure to ask yourself what areas actually need retouching and what things people are actually going to notice. There's a bit of a mess down here with the spider web, so I'll show you how to clean that up. What I want to do is select an image where most of the spider web is in focus. So I'm going to I'll go for this one. And then I'll just do a general paint where I'll paint out all this mess here. And then what I want to do is select a different brush. So I'll go pixels, and I usually have it quite soft. I just keep it on 0 most of the time. And then if that's no good, I'll bring it up a little bit. And then select an image where that thing underneath it is in focus. So there, and I'll paint either side of the spider web with this. And this brush is just a bit softer. It doesn't sort of paint in as hard. So it's quite nice for doing small details like spider webs and just any other small little details. Once you're happy with all your retouching, all you gotta do is come back up to edit and then click commit retouching. And as you can see, bottom left in the output images section, you'll have a retouched image. As you can see, I've got 2 there because I did a retake of this shot. But if you want to save your focus stack, so you want to come back to this project and start editing it another day, you come up to File and then Save Project As, and then save it wherever you like. But the thing with that is that you can only save your project once you've finished retouching. So if you want to come back to it another day, you have to commit retouching, save your project, and then go back into retouching, which is a bit annoying. I wish you could save it while you're retouching, but it's not too much of a problem. To export your final stacked image, what you want to do is select the correct output image in the bottom left, which is the bottom one here. And then you click File, Save Output Image. And as you can see here, we've got the export settings. So I've selected TIFF image to retain as much information in the image as possible. And then 16 bits RGB. Compression type none, and I've unticked extended dynamic range. And then all I've got to do is click save image and save it somewhere. So I'll just save it here, call it test. And yeah, it should be exported. It'll come up with a pop-up saying it's exported. There we are, and then hit OK. I've now got my image opened up in Photoshop, and this is where I do final bits such as sharpening, dodging and burning, removing distracting elements such as dust or crumbs. So yeah, let's get into it. The first thing I do is double click on my layer to unlock it, and then click Ctrl J to duplicate my layer, just always safe to have a backup when editing. And I usually start by checking the exposure. So I go adjustments, levels, and if there's like a gap there, I usually bring it over to brighten up, but there's no gap, so I'll just delete levels. Next up, I look at my image and think, where are the bright parts of my image and where are the dark parts? So right now, this is really distracting because it's a lot brighter than my subject. So what I want to do is decrease the brightness of that. So I usually go in curves and bring this down by like 1 cube. As you can see, that's making my image a lot darker. So around there, I can also bring it down even more from here if I want to make it darker. So around there looks good. And then as you can see, I've got this white box here. That's the mask on that adjustment that I've just made. So if I click Ctrl I, that will invert it. And if I go on my brush tool now I can use a white brush to paint in that adjustment onto my image. So I'm going to make sure my brush hardness is on 0, so it's nice and soft. And I'm going to paint over the very bright and distracting areas in my image with 100% opacity. For applying the adjustments to this dead piece of grass here, I'm going to change the properties of my brush slightly so it doesn't spill onto the background at all. So if I use a very big and soft brush, as you can see, it sort of creates a very dark edge on that bit of grass. So if I delete that and then right click to bring up this menu, bring up the hardness just a bit to about 35. And then all I'm going to do is make it a bit small, press left click once there, and then move up to the top and then hold shift and click again. And as you can see, it's created a line from the bottom to the top of that. And I'll do the same on the left, go up to the top, and then I'll do the middle as well. Make my brush a bit bigger. Select the bottom, shift, and then click. And that has just darkened that whole bit of dead grass there. And I can also darken this bit down here as well, doing the same sort of technique. And we've darkened a lot of the area now, which should bring more focus to my subject. So if we toggle that off, there's before and there's after. Staying on the theme of bringing attention to your subject, as you can see in the background, there's a lot of light green in the bottom of the frame, and there's more dark green in the top left. And to make my image look more natural and bring more attention to my subject, I want to have the lighter parts at the top of the frame and then the darker parts at the bottom. So to do that, I like to create a new layer and then press B to bring up the brush and then get my opacity to about 50% and paint black over the bottom of my image. And it might look too dark when it's changed my hardness back to 0. It might look quite dark at the moment, but I can always change the opacity of the layer later on. So all I gotta do now is come back to the layer down here on the bottom right, and there's opacity there. So we just change that to around 55. And I'll also paint a little bit of this left area as well, just to bring more attention to the subject. And this bit on the right as well. So as you can see, when I toggle it on and off, it just helps bring more attention to my subjects because the bottom of the frame is darker and the subject is a lot brighter. What I'm going to do now is add a new layer and then use a white brush at 100% opacity and do a few dabs up here. So I'll put one there, make my brush a bit bigger, one there, and I'll put one there as well. And then I'm going to come up to filter, Gaussian blur, and I want to use about 700 so it really blurs it, makes it look soft. Click OK, and then change the blend mode down here on that layer to soft light. And when I toggle that on and off now, you can see that makes it look like there's light coming from that direction of the frame. There is a bit spilling onto my subject, so if I select that layer, come down to this icon here and click on that, that will add a layer mask. And then if I zoom in and use a black brush, I can paint out any bits where it's leaked onto my subject. What I'm going to do now is come down here and select a layer 0 copy, which is my image layer, and then use the healing brush tool to remove any distractions from the image. And I don't want to remove anything from the subject because preferably I don't like removing detail from my subject. I like to keep all the crumbs and stuff that's on the subjects just as it is. But things like this over here is very distracting and potentially some little blobs down here. But I think the only thing I realistically need to remove is this big black blob here. It's very distracting. Like when I look at the image, I just notice it. So all I gotta do is sample a bit of this dead grass here. So I'll hold Alt, left click, and that will grab a sample of that. And then I just gotta brush over it like that. And there we go. I think I'm happy with all those adjustments I've made to my image. So I'm now gonna flatten my layer, sharpen it, and then crop it and export it. So to flatten my layer, I click Control, Shift, Alt, and E. As you can see, it's made a new layer and that's got all the adjustments baked into that layer. And then I want to duplicate that because I'm going to use the, what's it called? Filter or the high pass, that's what it's called. I'm going to use the high pass filter to sharpen the image. I usually like about 1 to 2 pixels, 1.5 works very well for most images. You want to have it so you can just about see the details of your subject. And then you go to blend mode and hit overlay. And if I zoom in now, you can see that's applied sharpening to my ladybird. Now I don't want the sharpening to be applied to the whole image, so all I've got to do is come down here to mask and hit that, and then hit Control I to invert the mask. And then I can paint in the areas where I want the sharpening to be applied to using a white brush. So I'm just going to paint the ladybird pretty much and nothing else. So I'll just paint around like this. And there we are, the sharpening's just applied to the ladybird. All I've got to do then is hold Shift and click that layer and then hit Control E. And I've merged the sharpening with the layer below, so it's baked into one image. And finally, I'm going to crop my image. So I like to crop most of the time in the native aspect ratio. And I start out by leveling out the image. So I usually just eyeball it because there's no like geometrical lines in this image to sort of align with. So I'm just going to eyeball it really. I think 5.9 looks good. Yeah. And I originally wanted to get like a composition where there's negative space on the left, but I just think it looks odd. I think it's because of the line going up and stuff. I don't know. So I think I'm going to crop in a different aspect ratio actually. I feel like the native one doesn't work very well for this image. Square seems to work very well. If I have the frame moved over a little bit like that, and then use this top rule of thirds and have that on the eyes, I think that'll be a nice composition. So something around there looks quite nice. I think I'll hit save on that. And yeah, that is our final image. Just before I export the image as a JPEG, I like to save the TIFF file. So all I gotta do is just click Control S, and then I usually discard layers and save a copy. And that just saves it over the original TIFF file that I loaded into Photoshop. And then when it comes to exporting the image, all I do is click File, Export As. You can also click Alt Shift Control W, that's the keyboard shortcut. Format, JPEG, quality I put to the highest, which is 7. And then yeah, export. I'm gonna call it test.jpg and then hit save and you're done. Hopefully that video was easy to follow along. If you want more editing videos like this, where you want to deep dive into my editing, let me know. And if you have any questions about my editing, let me know down in the comments and I'll try my best to reply to those. So yeah, I'm gonna end today's video here. As a reminder, there'll be a link down below in the description to my website where you can buy prints. If you want to support the channel, I'd highly appreciate if you bought a print, or if you don't want to buy a print, there's also affiliate links down below in the description where I get a small commission at no extra cost for you. So yeah, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, share, comment, all that good stuff, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.